Welcome back to another video, students. We are on episode 4 of our close reading series. Today we are looking specifically at literary analysis. Now, literary analysis is one of my favorite topics because it is why I love literature. It is when you're able to read something and make inferences, just like what we already learned about, to come up with some type of interpretation about what the book or the text is actually saying. So to do this, we're actually going to be focusing in on a short story by Nathaniel Hawthorne called The Minister's Black Veil. This is not the whole story right here, but this is only the portion that we're going to deal with. It is not even a quarter of the full story. You can go on Google and look up A Minister's Black Veil and find the text there, or you could go ahead and hit pause right now and read over this section. So now what I want to do right now is share with you some of the tools that I use when I'm reading a passage myself. This is my go-to toolbox, so to speak, of what I'm looking for when I'm close reading. If I know I'm going to do a literary analysis, that could be a book discussion, or it could be writing some type of paper, or even preparing for a class. So number one, the first tool that I focus on is diction and tone. I like putting them hand in hand because diction is word choice and tone is essentially the author's attitude. And so how do you know what the attitude of the author is? Well, it's based on the actual words that he's using through the narrator's mouth, or through the characters and the way that he's describing things. But it really does boil down to individual word choice. So what I was able to pull out from this short passage is that the diction that's used, at least from the beginning, is kind of ordinary, and then it leads into a grim tone. So here in blue, you could see some of the words I'm picking out that I thought were important in terms of the diction of this passage and showing that it's somewhat ordinary but then also grim. Words like grave or gate, that's the way you're walking, but it describes the kids as doing it as if they are a graver, somebody who's actually putting bodies into the ground while they're walking to church, mind you. Also, the idea of a throng of people, especially in the midst of a pandemic, doesn't really seem very happy. Words like cried and even pacing slowly is a little creepy, and expressing more wonder, not wonder in a good way, but like amazement in a bad way. So these are all individual words that are helping us see what the tone of this passage is. It starts off pretty ordinary. People are going to church, but there's a lot of words thrown in there that are popping out to me that just make it seem like this is a darker passage. Now, with that in mind, I also want you to notice what I highlighted in green here. These are words of what's actually happening in the passage based on the movement of the text and the movement of the characters. You have people that are pulling busily. You have people stooping, tripping merrily, looking sidelong, streaming into the porch, immediately turning about. But then if you juxtapose that or compare that with this idea that Mr. Hooper is just kind of going slow, it makes it even more fearful because you have here a pastor who's doing everything very creepily. He's moving slowly, almost meditatively. He's pacing. He has this veil on his head, and yet at the same time, right before he entered, there's a lot of hustle and bustle. But then as soon as he comes in, everything seems to stop and things start going slower. I almost picture like the Grim Reaper. So we've learned before the difference between making a factual claim of just stating what the text is saying and making an inference, reading between the lines. And so here's an example of that. A factual claim I might get when talking about diction and tone from this passage is that everyone in the village gathers for church and awaits the pastor, but his arrival is out of the ordinary and makes people curious. Now, it might sound pretty good. It might sound like something you want to put in a paper, but that is just facts. You cannot argue against that being in the text. It is literally what the text is saying. Not in so many words, I'm putting into my own words, but that's not an interpretation. More of an interpretation would be the inference side, and I have two different ones. One is, although the villagers express piety, being very religious, by attending church, they are not as innocent as they seem. Now, how would I know that? The text doesn't say that. But if I look into the text and I see this idea that everybody's heading to church, but the children seem to be tripping merrily while at the same time walking with a graver's gait, that's leaving the door open for some type of inference. And then also that these spruce bachelors are looking sidelong at the maidens on their way to church, that's almost implying some type of lust and desire that they have for these women while they're supposed to be going to a holy place. So that's certainly an inference. Now, the second inference I could come up with is that the minister is ostentatious. He's doing things for show, for an effect, when he enters in order to shake up the villagers' mundane routine. Now, does the text actually tell us that? No, that's an interpretation. And if you read the rest of the short story, you'll know that that might be an interpretation for the entire passage, not just this short little snippet that we got. But ultimately, this is me reading between the lines. I'm taking the facts and the details, but I'm using them to come up with some type of interpretation over what this really means. The second tool I like to focus on is symbolism. So as you see here, here's the passage where it actually brings up the black veil. Mr. Hooper had on a black veil. On a nearer view, it seemed to consist of 2 folds of crepe, which entirely concealed his features, except the mouth and chin, but probably did not intercept his sight further than to give a darkened aspect to all living and inanimate things. Now, to me, what I did here is I picked out this word, this symbol, black veil, because it is carried on throughout the entire text. It's what the whole story is focused on. It's what the title is. So the narrator and even the author, Mr. Hawthorne here, told us that this Mr. Hooper was wearing a black veil and that it was going to be important, and everybody's responding to it. So I know that's a clear symbol. Now, what I highlighted in green here is some aspects of this text that can tell me maybe what the black veil symbolizes for. This idea of it concealing his features, right? People are not able to look into him, so they don't know what he's actually thinking or feeling. They're not able to read his emotions. So that could possibly, I could infer from that, be saying that the symbol of the black veil is Mr. Hooper's way of being cut off from the rest of society and being separated, and that they don't understand him. But this other aspect, giving a darkened aspect to all living and inanimate things, to me, an even stronger inference that I can make there is that the black veil is a symbol for a change in your view of humanity. That Mr. Hooper no longer has an optimistic view of life and about his fellow brethren, but instead has a very sinister view, because now he's looking at everybody as if they're darkened, because maybe he knows what their true natures are, and that they are a darkened people, that they are sinful, even more so than he would have thought before. Now, as you can see here, the factual claim is that the veil is used to confuse the parishioners and make them afraid. That seems kind of obvious. It's hard to argue against that. But an inference, a harder level skill here, could be that the veil implies that Reverend Hooper's view of humanity has changed. He knows his parishioners are evil. He's now looking at everybody with a darkened face, and perhaps he even wants them to know that. Now, my third tool that I like to focus on is characterization. And honestly, it doesn't matter what order you do all this in. It depends on the text. So characterization here is going to be about the personality of the characters that are coming up in whatever passage you're reading. And so, obviously, the main character here is Mr. Hooper. He's even described as a gentlemanly person of about 30, though still a bachelor, and dressed with due clerical neatness, as if a careful wife had starched his band and brushed the weekly dust from his Sunday's garb. So that's an actual passage straight from the text, and that's only one sentence of the entire passage that we read, and already we're learning a lot about Mr. Hooper. We're building a character profile of him, essentially. And so all the words in blue are some type of adjectives that I'm taking out here that are important. So we know that he's a type of polite person. We know that he's also still fairly young. It's not like he's a 60 or 70-year-old pastor. He's almost 30, about 30. He could even be maybe 28, 29, 30, 31, 32. He could be around that age group, and he's still a bachelor. He's not married yet. And yet what's interesting, and what I highlighted in red, is we've seen the text talk about bachelors before. It was very early on talking about the spruce bachelors looking sidelong at the maidens. And here it seems like Hawthorne is trying to get our attention on something, because he calls him a bachelor, and yet he's dressed as if a wife had starched his band. So this is possibly saying or implying, and this is an inference, that Mr. Hooper has been with a woman before. Now, when you read further into the story, you know that he is engaged to an Elizabeth, and the wedding ends up being called off because of all this. But what's interesting here is there's almost this subtle implication that he did something he was not supposed to with this woman, and maybe the woman even helped get him dressed and helped iron out his clothes and starching his band and all of that. So it is very bizarre, but there's not that much evidence in the text to suggest that, but it is an inference, and it is an interesting one. But we are learning more about Mr. Hooper here, and it does play into our close reading. So the fourth tool is what I'm calling big picture ideas, some of these philosophical ways of looking at a text using literary theory even to do a more robust literary analysis. So the first big idea that I like to focus on is just humanity. What is the text actually telling us about people? How people should live, how people are living. Is there hope for humanity? Is there not? Are people good? Are people bad? Can people be redeemed? All these big picture ideas that we struggle with in real life come out of texts, because no book can be written that's not about humanity. Now, this goes into some aspects of literary theory, like a psychological view of literature, of looking at characters' motivations and why they're doing the things that they're doing, or sociological, how people in a society are forming laws and getting together and doing things together, and or even a didactic view of literature, which is when an author is crafting a message of instruction for his readers, very much like the Bible. So I could end up saying something like, everyone hides their sin and thus has their own veils. People are quick to judge even though they have their own black veils. That is an interpretation based on this view of humanity in the text. The second big picture idea could be with gender roles, and this is going into literary theories such as feminism, even queer theory, and sociological. Don't let these terms confuse you at all. At their simple base level forms, they're trying to look at how gender is defined within the text, how women are treated, how men are treated, who has the most authority in the relationships. And so in this text, obviously you already have, from what we read, some women come up, but yet they're usually the object of desire with the men, the spruce bachelors looking sidelong. You do end up getting an old woman speaking a couple times, and you do have later on in the story, which you didn't read, Elizabeth, who was the fiance to Mr. Hooper here, the Reverend. I could end up saying something like women are the object of desire and lead men to their downfall and sin, or I could even say something like Elizabeth defies cultural expectations by confronting Mr. Hooper in public. Usually when you're looking at gender roles, you're trying to look at how women are treated, who has the upper hand in this type of society, and is this a patriarchal society? Is this one that's actually more equal? Are there any feminist-like characters in the text? And even if a woman does not have many speaking lines, that's going to be significant, because then you have to ask, why in that society do women have no voice? Why in that society are women not allowed to speak much? And the last big picture idea I like to focus on is the idea of just history. What is this saying biographically about the author, Nathaniel Hawthorne, or what is it saying about the society in which he's writing? This is a bit different than other ones because it requires more research. You actually have to know something about the author, and you actually have to know something about that time period in which it's written to find out more information. So you could end up saying something like Puritanism is marked by hypocrisy. They try to adhere to scrupulous laws and customs that are unreasonable and impossible. Or Hawthorne reveals that Puritans were just as flawed as everybody else. So that would be taking a more historical approach. But notice in every single case, I'm moving beyond the factual and I'm trying to come up with some inferences. And I'm finding enough data and enough evidence to make a plausible interpretation of the text. That's ultimately what literary analysis is. So when you close read, you are truly trying to find out what the text is saying, more likely than not. Now, in The Minister's Black Veil, there's a lot of interpretations over why he is wearing the veil, just like there's a lot of interpretations over why Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote this story to begin with. So you could take any one of those big picture approaches and try to find out what your interpretation is. So I'd encourage you, read that whole story and try to come up with a big picture universal theme that's based on one of the big picture ideas, and use as evidence diction and tone, symbolism, even setting, characterization. Use those things as the backbone and as the crux and the support for your big picture idea.